Welcome to Bottled Petrichor, a podcast dedicated to discussing key topics in Islamic history and thought. In addition to a short lecture at the start of most episodes, we ask our guest experts questions submitted by listeners and allow them to share their thoughts in a safe environment. Please visit our Twitter page for feedback and question submission forms. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I am honored today to have Professor Ahmad Al-Jallad. Hello, Professor. How are you?
I'm well, and how about you?
I'm doing well, Professor. Thank you for asking. I just wanted to say again that I'm super thrilled to have you on today because in addition to being this incredibly prolific academic, you also have this super engaging and interesting Twitter page, which, a lot of people, including myself, have benefited from and have enjoyed a lot. And so I'm confident that, of course I'm going to enjoy this conversation. I'm confident that my audience will also appreciate the stuff that we talk about today as well. So kind of before we start, I wanted to ask, do you mind telling us a bit about yourself, your research, your interests, kind of what really got you interested in the study of, inscriptions?
Thank you. Yes, it's really a pleasure to be here with you and to talk to you about these subjects that interest me. I would consider myself an epigraphist and a linguist, but I'm interested in inscriptions, basically any kind of inscription that I can get my hands on. But my research focuses on ancient Arabian inscriptions, that is, inscriptions produced in the Pre-Islamic period, and we'll talk about exactly what we mean by Pre-Islamic later. The Pre-Islamic period in Arabia and adjacent areas, and in the alphabets, in both indigenous alphabets of Arabia and other writing traditions that Arabians may have employed. And because I'm interested in everything that I can get out of these inscriptions, I have to be sometimes much more than just, I shouldn't say just, but much more than an epigraphist, someone interested in the scientific study of these inscriptions themselves, the letter shapes and the language. But I have to, for example, sometimes go down and dabble in history and religious studies and social history and various other fields. And so I have very broad interests, and I would like to learn as much as I can about everything to do with these artifacts.
Understood. Thank you so much for that. And I think we should get right into it. And you had mentioned, we're going to talk a bit about pre-Islamic Arabia, but we could just start with that. What is pre-Islamic Arabia, and how can we know about it? How did pre-modern scholars kind of approach the subject, and what were some of their goals?
Right. So my research interest began a long time ago in the study of the comparative grammar of the Semitic languages. I was interested in how the Semitic languages evolved and developed over time. And one of the things that attracted me to the subject is that we were working in prehistory. When scientists compare the grammars of Semitic languages, they're trying to understand something about the development of language before there was necessarily a writing tradition associated with it, before there was a written language. So that's prehistoric. And prehistory, or the distant past in that way, has always appealed to me, the unknown. And I like to imagine that we can learn something about such unknown things through careful study of evidence. Now, pre-Islam, if we look at history as presented in Muslim sources, pre-Islam is really that final frontier, that great unknown. Most of what we had traditionally, knowledge we had about pre-Islamic Arabia from traditional sources, came in the form of folklore, of storytelling, people gathering accounts by individuals who were relating information based on previous generations, right? And we'll talk a little bit about how those methods worked. And so when I started studying in more depth the Semitic languages, I came across what was probably the most poorly understood corpus of Semitic languages, and that was the epigraphic material from ancient North and Central Arabia. And these were traditionally called ancient North Arabian. And what intrigued me about this material was that, well, it was so poorly understood, and this was in the 2008, 2007, 2008, 2009. In this period, we couldn't really say very much with confidence about the languages that these inscriptions inscribed, and in fact, many of these alphabets were not completely deciphered. So even when so that just basically looked like a huge puzzle, just calling to be investigated and studied, and so so it drew me. I was drawn to the field because of that. And at that time as well, there were no textbooks. There was no real corpus available. So I was fortunate enough to build a relationship with Michael McDonald, my dear friend and mentor and teacher in the subject, and study with him one-on-one what we could know about this epigraphic corpus. Now, what's intriguing about this material, these rock inscriptions, is that they come from pre-Islamic Arabia. That is, they're from the Arabian Peninsula and adjacent areas before the rise of Islam. But unlike the material that informed our traditional narratives, our traditional ideas about pre-Islamic Arabia, these texts were produced by inhabitants from that time period and from those places. They are eyewitnesses. They're eyewitness accounts, you can say. And so they're an entirely different kind of evidence. And once I became familiar with this kind of evidence and started working on it, I realized that we were in fact talking about two different pre-Islamic Arabias, two completely different timelines. You have the pre-Islamic Arabia that we know from Muslim sources, which we call the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, and that pre-Islamic Arabia concerns primarily the events and the political and cultural landscape of the peninsula in any real detail only a few centuries before the rise of Islam, whereas the pre-Islamic Arabia that we could know from inscriptions and from archaeology would stretch back thousands of years, right? And extend all the way to the rise of Islam. And what was interesting is that the two pre-Islamic Arabias weren't always compatible. There were overlaps. But we often got a very different image of pre-Islamic Arabia based on these documentary sources, eyewitnesses like the inscriptions, when we compare them to the accounts that we find in Muslim sources. And so so there was this huge opportunity to learn about this place that in the popular imagination we feel like we knew so much about, right? The pre-Islamic Arabian ideas about pre-Islamic Arabia serve as an interpretive or an exegetical tool in Muslim literature, and so there's this idea that we know quite a bit about how things were in the Jahiliyyah. That the Arabian Peninsula was much more rather isolated. That the Arabians were barbaric and lacking writing and all of these sort of topoi, and that. That picture just looks completely different than what we see in the documentary sources, where we have ancient civilizations going back to the Bronze Age. We have writing, copious amounts of writing all over the peninsula, extensive contacts with the rest of the Near East, and indeed, at least pre-Islamic South Arabia should properly be considered one of the third pole of civilization in the ancient Near East. So that working with those two timelines in mind, I became very interested in trying to contribute to our writing of the history of pre-Islamic Arabia based on documentary sources, based on archaeology, epigraphy, and things that we and material that we can scrutinize from that time period. So then that begs the question: what do we consider of the sources that were compiled by Muslim scholars in the Middle Ages? Right? I mean, they have a lot of accounts of pre-Islamic Arabia. What was that material? One of the projects that I sort of toy with, an idea that I toy with, is and hopefully I'll get to writing one day. I mean, I have some notes. Is a commentary of Ibn al-Kalbi's Kitab al-Asnam, based on the epigraphic and archaeological sources. So the Kitab al-Asnam is a book by Ibn al-Kalbi, 9th century writer, on the religion of pre-Islamic Arabia, on the different idols and the different religious practices, cultic practices associated with the idols before the rise of Islam. And the image we get there is so different than what we actually see in the epigraphic record. So, for example, Ibn Kalbi documents the worship of idols all across Arabia. At, for example, Dumat al-Jandal, he documents the worship of a deity called Wad. Now, these are real deities, of course. Wad is found is obviously mentioned in the Quran. But when we look at the epigraphic map, we see that Wad's worship was, in fact, all the way on the other side of the peninsula in South Arabia, and it was the chief deity of the Mannaeans. And what's more, the polytheism in South Arabia basically died off in the 4th century, at least as a state-sponsored religion. And there's no evidence for Wad actually being worshipped by that far north or in Dumat al-Jandal. And it's not an argument from the absence of evidence, not at all, because you have thousands and thousands of texts at Dumat al-Jandal from the middle of the 1st millennium BCE until the rise of Islam. And in fact, there's no worship of Wad there ever documented in the inscriptions. And in fact, the only religious information we have from Dumat al-Jandal in the 6th century is a Christian Arabic inscription. So quite a different image. So why then do the sources, like Muslim sources of this sort, look so different than what we can see in the epigraphy and archaeology? And I think it's because when we look at the way the Jahiliyyah was written, we're mistreating it, or I shouldn't say mistreat, maybe so, but we're not understanding it for what it is. See, Muslim writers, when they were collecting information about the Jahiliyyah, they were, I think, one could better compare them to folklorists. They were interested in collecting folklore stories about a mythical age, really. And their methodology was just that. They would ask individuals who had, for example, some kind of ancestral connection to the Arabian Peninsula about the happenings of the Jahiliyyah and about things like polytheism. Of course, polytheism becomes a sort of a topos in the Jahiliyyah, and so Ibn al-Kalbi is actually just asking informants, so do you tell me stories you know about the Jahiliyyah? Tell me about these gods or these practices. And he gathers all of these folk tales into a book and presents them. Now, it would be a mistake for us to simply read that book and assume that we are dealing with documentary history the way we would if, for example, we excavated a temple in Arabia and read its inscriptions. They're not comparable. And so the Ibn al-Kalbi is actually going around and collecting folklore in that way. And when scholars become interested in things like this, they become interested in folklore, that will in a way contribute to the generation of stories. So there was no doubt that people of this time period knew that the Jahiliyyah was a place of interest, and that scholars were going around and asking questions about it. So Arabians or people with some kind of ancestral tie to the Arabian Peninsula would certainly be aware that they were going to be asked questions about it. And, they'll respond with in ways that they think would be interesting or entertaining to the people asking. We're not dealing with we're not dealing within a scholarly framework as we would think of it today. And I think the closest analog to this is, for example, if you compare the kind of research done on supernatural things like Bigfoot. If you go out to the Pacific Northwest, you have a lot of Bigfoot research being done, which comes down to mostly asking people about Bigfoot encounters, asking people about their experiences, or asking about the experiences of their of people they know or their ancestors, asking people about Bigfoot encounters, and asking people to explain these stories within the local landscape, and that is the way that that basically sums up how we know about these kinds of folkloric creatures, and that is sort of what pre-Islamic Arabia, or the Jahiliyyah, let's say, the pre-Islamic Arabia of medieval sources looks like, right? And so the inscriptions and the archaeology available to us now give us, for the first time, the opportunity to step away from that mythological framework and interrogate or ask questions of this period based on evidence that we can be sure dates to the period in question, right? And we can see this isn't the first time, you see, in history where such a thing was possible. This was always more or less possible. And I think the characterization of Muslim scholarship on the Jahiliyyah as a scholarship of folklore or collections of folklore is further supported by the fact that all the materials needed for an epigraphy or a discipline, an epigraphic science to have emerged in the Islamic period, all the materials, all the things needed were there. For example, the Al-Hamdani, who was one of the great, let's say, polymaths of the Abbasid period, he wrote a description of the Arabian Peninsula, and he was interested in pre-Islamic Arabia, of course. And in one of the volumes of his Iqlil, he has a script chart. Okay, very interesting. A script chart which lists the ancient Musnad alphabet. Now, this was the alphabet used in pre-Islamic South Arabia, and he gives the shapes. And we know this through copies, of course. So the shapes are a little bit altered, but we can still make out what they originally were, and they're pretty accurate. So he gives the shapes of the Musnad letters, and then he gives the Arabic letter equivalents. And he's right. I mean, they understood, they still knew the script of the alphabets in ancient South Arabia in this period. And they had all of the inscriptions around them. They had all the monuments. They could see them. And what's fascinating is that there was never an attempt to write the history of pre-Islamic Arabia informed by all of these monuments that were around them, which they could, if they made the effort, read, in fact. Sure, the language of these inscriptions was quite different from classical Arabic, but they had, with the local dialects, even Himyaritic continued to be spoken in pockets in the period. And with knowledge of the alphabet, they would have certainly been able to decipher its language. And they would have been able to use these artifacts in the writing of pre-Islamic Arabian history, but they didn't. And I think the way to understand why they didn't do that is because they were more interested in the storytelling and the folkloric aspect of pre-Islamic Arabia than they were in actually trying to write some kind of positivist history based on evidence and documents. In that period. So it took until the 19th century until these texts were, became until Europeans became aware of these texts, and then they were deciphered, and the voices of pre-Islamic Arabia were heard once again.
So thank you so much for that. And so we're kind of talking about this stuff, and so it probably makes more sense to just ask, what was then the pre-Islamic Arabian landscape like in terms of language, religion, and empire? What were the types of languages spoken? Were people generally bilingual? And how mutually intelligible were the different languages in the region? And did people have names for these different languages?
Very, very good questions. Yes. So when we look at Muslim period sources, and this may have been the case even up to the 7th century, this is why such sources look this way. There were basically two main languages in Arabia. You had Himyaritic, or the language of ancient South Arabia, and then you had Arabic. The rest of Arabia was Arabic, and Arabic that was characterized by the language, the performance register of the pre-Islamic poems, right? Which I do think, by the way, are authentic, are pre-Islamic, and we could talk about that later. But nevertheless, that language there was being used all across the Arabian Peninsula, except for certain places where people spoke a kind of corrupted version of this language, or a version that isn't to be relied upon. But when we push back in time, what's fascinating is that we'll see that Arabia it could be characterized by hyperlinguistic diversity. The earliest texts date to they come from South Arabia, and may date to the beginning of the first millennium BCE or the end of the second millennium BCE. And but these texts are the alphabet itself. The entire concept of the alphabet actually comes from the north, so it had to make its way down to South Arabia sometime in the second millennium. And as it made its way down, it's reasonable to hypothesize that the script, this South Arabian script, when we think of the South Arabian script, we can simply call the Arabian alphabet or the South Semitic script, diffused all across the peninsula. And so we have in Central and North Arabia, basically every major oasis has its own writing tradition, its own variant of the South Semitic script, this indigenous alphabet of Arabia, not related to the Arabic script as we know it. So it has its own writing tradition, its own language, and then the deserts as well between these places are filled with inscriptions. Some of these inscriptions are produced in alphabets that have been deciphered and their language can be understood, and some of them are produced in inscriptions in alphabets that are deciphered, but their language is completely unintelligible, meaning that these inscriptions reflect languages that are no longer extant, that have gone extinct, that were spoken in Inner Arabia and have disappeared. And there just simply isn't enough texts to work out a decipherment of the language yet. And there are other cases where the scripts themselves are not deciphered. So, for example, there are the ancient inscriptions of Oman. Many of these are painted, but some are carved on rock. The alphabet is not deciphered. We can't read the texts at all. There are some alphabets that are partially deciphered, meaning that we can read some text but we can't read others. And so, and that this situation, we don't know how old this situation is. When you're looking at a rock inscription carved in a mysterious alphabet that hasn't been deciphered, this text could come from 400 AD, 400 CE or 400 AD, or it can come from 1000 BC. Right, it is impossible to know at this moment. You have to take a case-by-case basis, but it's impossible to know just by looking at the text. So we see this. We also see a lot of linguistic diversity. What is missing, and what is absolutely fascinating when we look at all this linguistic diversity throughout the Arabian Peninsula up into the 6th century, nothing that looks like, or nothing that is identical to, let's say, nothing that is identical to the language of the pre-Islamic poems. And of course, nothing identical to what we see collected later and standardized. Well, we wouldn't want to say standardized, but sort of formalized as classical Arabic has appeared in writing. There are lots of Arabic, lots of different dialects of Arabic, but nothing that looks so much like the language of the poems in classical Arabic yet, right, from all over the peninsula. And you have lots of tribal groups. So the main tribe that we think of, the great tribes of Arabia, that are mentioned in Islamic sources, for example, Kinda and Mudar, and we can go on, Qahtan. These groups do exist, but they are rather late. They are not the most ancient tribal groups. They are. If we look at the entire chronology of ancient Arabia, they appear on the scene rather late. There are many tribal groups and that are attested that we had no idea about except from the inscriptions. What's also interesting is that you have tribal groups that are mentioned in the Bible as Arabian that also appear in the inscriptions of Arabia. So, for example, Massa or Madian. And you can go on. There are several groups. Well, Qaidar hasn't been attested yet. There's been a hypothesis about the reading of a single inscription that may attest Qaidar, but it's unclear. But nevertheless, these groups are attested throughout North Arabia. The inscriptions also attest the existence and give us an insight into the extinct Arabs, the lost Arabs, groups like Thamud and Ad, which were real groups, real tribal groups. They actually are not. Thamud is a bit more ancient. Ad seems to have thrived in northern Arabia and the area of Jordan. Their capital, Iram, or their center, maybe their cultural center was Iram, which is modern day Wadi Ram. We know this from the inscriptions. So we have access to the language of Ad, the language of Thamud. We know where they were chronologically in time and in place, Northwest Arabia and the Southern Levant. And we know what kind of alphabets they used. So it's so absolutely fascinating in that respect. And all of this, we can follow this all the way up to the 6th century, indeed. And so we have a beautiful. It's not complete, of course. There are a lot of holes, but from the early, let's say from the early first millennium BCE until the 6th century, which was previously one could consider in terms of periodization prehistoric Arabia. Right, there weren't examples of writing. There weren't anything to make that period. You couldn't study that period through local writings. in fact, today that is completely that is completely in the light of history. Maybe a dim light of history because the inscriptions are not always clear, but it's certainly a historical period now. Absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for that, Professor. And just before we move on to the next question, you had mentioned something about the authenticity of pre-Islamic poetry. I was wondering if you'd kind of talk more about that. And I don't know really when skepticism emerged about really the reliability or the authenticity of pre-Islamic poetry, maybe Taha Hussein or something. But I was wondering if you'd kind of talk about it and tell us why there is skepticism towards it and why you believe that it is actually authentic.
Well, I think in this particular question, thank you for the question. So it's one that's very interesting to me. I think we shouldn't we should be very precise in how we talk about this material, and when we use the term authentic, we can't mean that every syllable is faithfully transmitted from whatever point of origin it had in pre-Islam. But at the same time, it wouldn't mean that if something wasn't faithfully transmitted, the entire corpus should be thrown out. Now, there was skepticism, Taha Hussein's famous skepticism on the language of the pre-Islamic poems. He said they were incredibly uniform and don't reflect the diversity of tribal dialects that were in use in that time period. So that looked like they were later forgeries. It's an interesting argument. The thing that opens this material up for that discussion is the fact that they're transmitted. I mean, we don't have these texts. We don't have copies of these texts from the pre-Islamic period. They're transmitted orally and collected later. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. I mean, that's the same story of the Vedas, for example, that were transmitted orally for centuries, right? With the case of the pre-Islamic poems, I think and of course, we're not speaking. We can't talk about every single line, but we'll say the basic gist, the core material of these poems. I think reflects a pre-Islamic provenance because they seem to reflect the same cultural background that we get in the pre-Islamic inscriptions. So the stopping and weeping at graves, the same kind of vocabulary, the cultic, the ritual mourning, all of this is almost exactly what we find in ritual mourning texts in, for example, Safavidic, primarily in Safavidic, which is a corpus of ancient Arabian inscriptions that comes from the Syro-Jordanian basalt desert, right? Almost very similar vocabulary. Very similar cultural themes, but what's more, so there are aspects of the pre-Islamic poems that I think if they were created, if they were forgeries at a later period in time, they wouldn't have been able to get these metaphors right. So there are certain metaphors used in the pre-Islamic poems that reveal a knowledge of cultural practices in pre-Islamic Arabia that were not known in the 7th or 8th century. For example, at least as far as we know, they weren't known by later commentators who would have been accused of forging these things, and have only come to light in modern times through epigraphic and archaeological research. And for example, let's consider this nice line by Labid, where he is talking about the landscapes. He's describing how torrents lay bare the marks of the tent in the landscapes, right? And this image is compared to what he calls zubur, usually translated as writing, and he calls it like the zubur, the pens of which renew its content, right? And almost in all cases, this image was thought to be one of pens with ink writing on a document, right? Painting in a way. But that is not necessarily a good metaphor for the way torrents carve the landscape, because they don't just go over it, they actually remove dirt and lay bare and open things up. But the term zubur, if we look at it from ancient South Arabia, zubur was a term for for the day-to-day documents that that they used for administration and for personal letters and things of this sort. These were sticks, small sticks or pieces of bark from palm trees, and they would write on these documents their day-to-day things, and you wouldn't write on this with ink. In fact, you would use a sharp stylus and you would carve on these sticks when they were still wet. You would carve your text. So all of a sudden we see that metaphor takes on a completely different light. It makes much more sense when we think about what Zubur was in its pre-Islamic South Arabian context, you see? And so things like that, little metaphors of that sort, I think suggest that some lines, verses, or perhaps entire chunks of these texts go back to a period where these metaphors were widely understood, and that would have been the pre-Islamic period. Now, a lot of this material is, of course, traditional as well. So when we say Labid's mu'allaqa, we don't necessarily mean that all of this is the original creation of the mind of Labid. Of course, this is traditional literature. So think of Labid as a bard. He's remixing and compiling material that was widely known. It could have been even much more ancient than that period as well. So we have references to the supernatural fate, for example, which is all over the pre-Islamic inscriptions, especially in Safavidic, and you get it in Labid with very similar metaphors. The metaphor of fate shooting arrows, or at the living, at her victims. Fate being, of course, death. Same metaphors seen in the pre-Islamic inscriptions. So all of this, I think, speaks to there being a cultural connection, a real one, between this corpus of material and ancient Arabia. Now, that doesn't mean every single line dates to that period. Of course, when things are transmitted, they will each bard, or everyone who's transmitting it, will change it a little bit, may insert a line, which is very easy to do with poetry, because you just have to basically keep the meter and the rhyme. So you might add material, you could edit things slightly. So it's not to say that that every single word, every single letter is exactly as it was, but that in general, very much like we might speak of literature like Beowulf, which was transmitted as well, and has certainly been edited in the transmission process. But in essence, it comes from the pre-Islamic period.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that, Professor. Now, this next set of questions is something that we've been touching upon throughout this episode, but I think it's important to kind of ask them here again. How has the discovery of new inscriptions advanced our knowledge of pre-Islamic Arabia, the Quran, and early Islam? What about the Arabic language? Do you think that the history of Arabic and its development in the Islamic period will be rewritten based on these new inscriptions that we're finding?
That's a very good question, and I think we need to treat what medieval Muslim scholars said about the history of Arabic in its context. So much like the writing of the history of the Jahiliyyah, right? These scholars were interested in folklore. They were interested in storytelling. They weren't necessarily interested in saying disprovable things about pre-Islamic Arabia by the study of artifacts and what have you. So when it comes to the history of Arabic, it's the same way. The history of Arabic and the Arabic language itself becomes, in this period storytelling, becomes an important symbol of authenticity and Arabness. And so stories are told about Arabic to position it in larger biblical history, or to include certain tribal groups or certain regions into the fold of Arabness. So, for example, one of the most popular explanations of Arabic, the origins of Arabic in the Islamic period, was that Arabic was first spoken in South Arabia by a man named Ya'rub. Now, this story is important for including the Yemenis, the ancient Yemenis, into the fold of Arabness. Now, it was very obvious in this time and even earlier that the Yemenis, the South Arabians, were not speaking Arabic. They were speaking, and by this period, a language we know very little about. We have only a few words and maybe one or two sentences preserved of something called Himyaritic. But when we look at the ancient inscriptions of Yemen, we find 4 main languages that are as distinct from Arabic as Hebrew or Aramaic are, and some even more distant. For example, if we go to Hadramut and we see the ancient language of Hadramut based on its inscriptions, it is about as far away, it's as distant from Arabic as, for example, Ethiopic. I mean, it's very, very, very far. So there is by using Arabic and positioning Arabic in certain places in history, you can weave people who haven't traditionally been under the umbrella of Arab into that narrative, and give them a role to play and let them have a stake in this identity. Now, you see, that's not history writing that's not the kind of the linguistic history that we would write today. So we don't, from the Islamic period sources, we don't have a history of Arabic. We have these kinds of folk tales and a mythological past for Arabic, which is fascinating and interesting in its own right, and should be studied as well. But when it comes to a history of Arabic, that is, how did Arabic as a terrestrial vernacular develop over time? That is something that was that story started to be written really in we're talking about Arabic in the pre-Islamic period, of course, in the 19th century. And the issue is that in the 19th century and even in the 20th century, without recognizing the role that these inscriptions could play, and without properly deciphering and understanding them, that the history of pre-Islamic Arabic was almost entirely speculative. It was based on trying to distill the past from materials collected by the Arab grammarians, and by as well the how do you say it? Using historical linguistics on historical linguistic methods. This is the way people reconstruct languages by the comparison of grammar, reconstruct extinct stages of a language by applying those methods to the modern dialects and applying them to the material collected by the classical grammarians as well. But with the decipherment of many of these inscriptions, and especially in the corpus that I spend most of my time working on, I'm mostly busy with is Safiitic, a corpus of more than 40,000 texts now. These texts date, almost 1,000 years before, at the earliest perhaps, before the activity of the grammarians. So they turned that period that we were interested previously interested in, which was previously prehistory, they make it history. And we could start to see the way the Arabic language looked in this period before the rise of Islam. And it gives you a completely different comparative dimension when it comes to interpreting things, like we talked a little bit about the pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. Well, what do words mean in these poems? What exactly is Zubr referring to, for example? What is it? We can now bring a different kind of interpretive lens to the matter. And then sometimes that works better than what classical commentaries gave us. The same with trying to interpret some vocabulary in the Quran. The same with even trying to understand some of the grammar of the Quran, which is, if you take it on its own terms, quite different from what becomes normative classical Arabic. And this is something that the grammarians recognized as well, that Quranic Arabic was its own thing. Well, we have inscriptions now that from the pre-Islamic period that lead right up into the period of the Quran's the collection of the Quran, and these texts can bear on those types of philological questions. Another thing comes, for example, with trying to understand one of the things that anyone looking closely at Qurans will see is that the spellings, the orthography. There are a lot of what from the point of view of normative classical Arabic pronunciation and normative classical Arabic spelling, there are a lot of anomalous spellings, or rather odd or strange ways to write words that were in many ways not fully understood. By having the pre-Islamic inscriptions available, we can now understand the development of those kinds of spellings. Why, for example, manat is written with a waw. Why, for example, mi'a has an extra alif there. Why and so on. There are so many more examples we can bring forth, and I think the interview you had with Dr. Van Bruten we'll go into detail about that, and interested listeners can tune in there. But all of this material, all of the things that we now can understand, and in some ways our textbook explanations, for example, when it comes to Quranic spellings, were all made possible by people going out, doing surveys in the deserts, going out to collect this material. It was there. It's been there for thousands of years, for more than 1,000 years in the Arabic material, and thousands of years otherwise. But it took people to go out and actually care about that material and document it, right? And put the effort into trying to understand it, decipher it, and realizing this important, this invaluable resource and its importance for the for later historical questions that we always took the answers we had for granted. And in fact, it's always a much more complicated situation.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. And before we move on to these kind of rapid fire questions about the process, I was wondering if you would tell us a bit about your most important finds to date, and maybe some of the adventures that you have when you're kind of going about looking for inscriptions.
It's epigraphy is so epigraphy is the scientific study of inscribed of inscriptions, inscribed objects, usually on rocks, but especially in the Arabian context, on rock. Now, these texts are the corpus that I'm interested in is Safaitic, and these texts are very, very far away in the desert. They're not you can't just stroll out and have a little tour. But like I said, their importance, they are our first port of call for the writing of the history of pre-Islamic Arabia. They are the indigenous voices, we can say, of the people who live there, of the pre-Islamic Arabians, and it's this material really that that will allow us to flesh out the history of this period and allow us to interpret later accounts. So the fact that it's so far away and so difficult to access is really not consequential. I can do anything to get to this material. And so I started doing field work. I collaborate with my colleague Ali Al-Manasir in Jordan, who works with the Department of Antiquities. And all this field work is collaborative. You never go out by yourself. And Ali Al-Manasir is a fantastic colleague. He sorts out everything on the Jordanian end. He permits and knows the landscape like no one else, the epigraphic landscape. So he can he is able to plan what to do with the very short amount of time that we have. Because you might be able to survey for about 2 weeks before you have more material than you know what to do with, and before exhaustion completely takes over. So surveying is a wonderful thing. It's a lifestyle in a way. So you keep doing it. Like after this Corona thing, I found myself unable to go to the field, but start reproducing. When I go to visit national parks, I end up finding myself surveying there, collecting 19th century American inscriptions. It's just it becomes a sort of an addiction. It's a wonderful thing. But the let's see. So usually when we go into Jordan, we will all meet up at a camp at the edge of the desert, usually in one of these towns, Ruwaishid or Safawi. And then we head out early in the morning, 4 or 5 in the morning, before it gets too hot, because the ride out there, while it might not seem that far, we might just go 10 miles or so into the desert, 20 miles max. The ride out there takes hours and hours, sometimes 4 hours to reach where you want to survey, because the landscape is so difficult. It is a basalt desert, not a sand desert. So it's rock mixed oftentimes with flint. It's hilly, and these rocks can often be sharp, so you will lose tires. And you can only drive a couple of miles an hour, and you feel every bump, right? So if you have motion sickness, this is absolutely not something you can do. And you go out there very slow, very difficult way. And you to a site that you might have chosen by looking at satellite imagery and talking to locals. Now, the people that you go out with, you have to cooperate with locals as well, local Bedouin, because they're the only people who actually know how to get around the desert. There's no cell phone connection, and you can't drive wherever you want, so you can't look at a map and say, okay, we are this far from the highway and drive in a straight line. There are only certain ways that you can go. Your car can get stranded, you can break down. So it's very important to cooperate with a local who understands how to navigate in the desert. And once you get to and then once you get to your site, you get out and you have your equipment, GIS, your scales, photograph, and equipment to photograph, and sometimes you might have some very rudimentary archaeological material equipment as well, and you will. We'll walk around and survey in order to capture everything, because you can never know what's out there at any given site. You have to kind of move meter by meter, cover the landscape, cover any given site meter by meter, and make sure that you look at every single rock. Right, so it's the attention to detail is incredibly important, and every season promises a new discovery. Every season promises the addition of new information to science, and some season and the potential to completely change our understanding of really big questions. So I can tell you a few stories from last season, ones that are. One that stand out to me now. On, I think it was around the fourth or fifth day, we decided to survey a rather large wadi. Now the wadi was you just couldn't drive down it. The cars wouldn't go. It was the herbage was too thick. It was one that received a lot of water, and so even in June there was still a lot of herbage, bushes. You couldn't drive. So we planned to walk about 10 miles down this wadi, surveying everything on both sides, and meet our trucks on the other side, okay, our cars on the other side. These are these Nissan pickup trucks. So we do that. We tell everyone, I'm out there surveying with some students, and some of these are young tough guys who think they need a lot less water than they actually do, and they don't want to carry it. So I say, come on, we need to, we have our supplies. A few guys didn't bring in as much water as they should have, and didn't wear as much clothing as they should, because it's a great place to work on your tan, as you can imagine. Well, that's fine. And we start surveying, and we're going, and my colleague Ali Al-Nasir is up at the top of a hill, a cliff, about maybe about 80, 100 feet above the wadi. Beautiful place. And he makes a signal, come join me. I found something. We go up there. We rush up there, and we see three cleared out areas in the basalt. And the minute you see cleared out areas like this points towards human occupation, human activity, right? And one of these circles had a perimeter of inscriptions, which was interesting. The middle one had nothing, and then the final cleared out circle that was overlooking the wadi at the edge of the cliff. When you got close, you could see that there were some sunken in stones, and that there was basically a stone circle, that it was very clearly a burial. Okay, so we were dealing with this very interesting burial funerary installation. Nothing like it had ever been discovered before. And then we started to look and read the inscriptions, and indeed this was a burial of a woman, and there were about 80 inscriptions memorializing her, including one by her father, and she's described simply by the title Ain Rasin, which in later Arabic means bride, but we don't know what it means here. It could be something, obviously it's a title for a important woman in this context, and they're grieving for her. And this entire burial installation was set up to memorialize her. Perhaps her body lay at the pit at the edge. There may have been a mourning circle, and the inscription sort of memorialized. Whatever the case was, nothing like it had ever been discovered. We had discovered a new burial installation, and the inscriptions were fascinating. Many new words, many new grammatical features, but also insight into a new kind of burial custom, a new kind of funerary custom that we just had no clue about. Incredibly exciting. Spent about 5 hours documenting that. As much as we could. We'll go back and fill in any holes we had before we prepare the publication. But it is a huge discovery, and the excitement you feel of being able to see something that nobody had seen before in millennia, more than a millennium, to read texts that nobody had read in more than a millennium, and to bring that to the scholarly community is there's nothing compared to it. And one of the things, the reason why this was so beautifully preserved, is that it seems that the modern Bedouin weren't using this wadi very much. The way we knew that is, well, one, it's very difficult to access with your cars, and two, there were no cigarette packaging anywhere, and cigarette packaging is a good way to know whether there have been people around in recent times. So and it doesn't go anywhere; it's plastic. So there was nothing like that. So this was really we'd been the first people to come here in who knows how many centuries, and we continued down, walking this wadi, and maybe by mile 6 or 7 or something. Some of the students started to really feel it. The water was running out, sunburned, feeling really tired, panicking. And I was worried. It's like, well, maybe we have to carry these guys. They didn't bring enough water. But we had enough water to give them anyway. It was fine. We kind of compensated for that, but they were really exhausted. One guy was just absolutely spent and despaired at the idea of walking another 3 miles or so. And while we keep trucking along and surveying what we can, documenting what we can, and we found hundreds and hundreds of inscriptions in this wadi. We see at the top of a hill to our left, and we're walking little kafiyya, an arm waving, and it is our Bedouin driver, and he says, he found a place to park that was closer and was just in time. And so we go off track and start walking towards him. And as we start going up that hill, we see a path, an ancient path, but people had been walking up this hill in this way before. And so we start following that path. Okay, it takes us up the hill, and once we get to the top, we see where they park. They park next to a dry lake bed, huge lake bed that's dry. And we continue down that path. That path takes us to a small cairn, and that cairn is filled with inscriptions, Safavidic inscriptions, but also Greek. And I start photographing, but my colleagues want to go back to the car. Of course, we need to hurry, so we're going to come back the next day. But I started photographing and documenting what I could here. We go back to the cars. We rest up. We have a great time. We go back, and it was a fascinating day. It was a wonderful day. Huge discoveries. Now, months later, as I'm home, looking over and preparing the materials that we discovered for publication, I come to the photographs that I took at that site. And that site that we discovered by accident, simply because we had become too exhausted, and by the luck of our Bedouin driver having found a place to park. We found the inscriptions there provided our first evidence for the use of the term Arab as a term of self-identification among the nomads in the area. And you can think of how important this is. There are so many books now dedicated to Arab identity and reconstructions of what that might have meant. And anyone who reads these books realizes there's so little evidence from the pre-Islamic period that helps us understand this. And then here we are, 2 new inscriptions that make it absolutely clear that the general term that people living in this area, that the nomads of this area used for themselves, was Arab. Absolutely fascinating, huge discovery, and every year has stories like this. Every year comes with surprises, and sometimes we don't even know what we discovered. So in 2018, so 2 years ago, we were surveying, and we were surveying a bit south where it was a bit sandy, and we reached a cairn that was just covered in sand, and sand is nobody likes sand because it gets everywhere, and that's a joke for those on the internet. But the sand is tends to hit the stones and the rocks, and it weather the inscriptions, so it's very difficult to read texts that have been subject to this weathering. And in the south, most inscriptions tend to be a bit shorter. The further south you go in the Safavidic area, the texts tend to be a little bit shorter, less interesting, mostly names and drawings. And so, we're surveying because you must collect everything, but we didn't have big hopes to discover great things here. And, we're surveyors, we're not excavating. So we're documenting archaeological sites, but we're not excavating things necessarily. And I'm walking, and we're on this site, and then I put my foot down on one of these like sandy patches, and usually your boot sinks a little bit, and my boot didn't sink. There was something hard there. I said, "What is this?" I go down, I start digging up a little bit, and I pull out this beautiful rock, 30 centimeters by 20 centimeters, so quite large, filled with writing, with some magical figures on it as well, a sun disk, absolutely gorgeous rock. I pull it out, I start reading it on the site. I read immediately. I see the words Sab'ata Angum, which means in Safavidic 7 stars, which must be a reference to Pleiades. And in the context of the inscription, it is indeed a reference to the Pleiades. This person was talking about the heliacal rising of the Pleiades, and it's supposed to bring, he wanted to pasture on herbage that came after this period, but the herbage was bad, and so he suspected Nag'at, that is the evil eye. He suspected the evil eye. Then he makes a prayer against the evil eye, against this kind of envious eye. Fascinating text. Nothing like this had been seen. Of course, you're seeing how this is foreshadowing themes that we get later. And the text continued on. It was a bit strange. I didn't bother reading it, and I filed, and then we left. I was excited. I was very happy. We left. And I forgot about the text because there had been so many other things that we had discovered in the meantime, and I was busy with publishing those that I had forgotten about this text. You see, and then because of the Corona stoppage, I was able to go back through photographs and go back through materials that we collected a long time ago, and I saw this text again, and I finished reading the inscription, and the inscription ended with an invocation to Dusharay. That is Dusares, the chief god of the Nabateans, who is called Min Raqmo, the one from Raqm, which is Petra, right? And you know that this is one of the interpretations, a very convincing one of the term Raqim in the Quran, that you have a nice article by May Shadel on this subject. So the Raqmo from Petra, and then it continues, and to Allat, who is from Min Ain Mim Nun. Now, what is Ain Mim Nun? We have no idea. It could be Amman, of course, which is not very far away. It could be, but there's another. But it could be some other local sanctuary that has the same three-letter root. It could be or a three-letter sequence. It could be a skeleton. It could be Oman. I mean, Oman is really too far, and there's no reason to think it's Oman as such, but rather maybe another place named that locally. In any case, huge questions. So this one, again, another beautiful inscription. So much new information, so much to discover, so much to learn. I sent it in for publication. Hopefully, it'll appear maybe at the end of this year, early next year. So much to learn, and it was discovered by stepping in the right place. Very easy to have surveyed the site because it was covered by sand and just not to have stepped there. And it would have been discovered maybe later when archaeologists came back to the site. But who knows when that's going to be? Right? Who knows? It could be a century from now. But it was just from stepping in the right place that this big discovery could have been made at this moment. Right?
Absolutely riveting. Thank you so much for that. I think what's admirable, besides the fact that you're kind of braving this harsh temperature, these long, difficult commutes, is the fact that you're able to resist this impulse to just say, okay, we see this word and we know what this word means in this language or in this usage, and we can just apply that to this. And I think it's admirable that you're able to resist that urge. I'd like to move on to these rapid fire questions, and I think they're important. So we're just going to start with the first one. What compelled people to write? Who was the intended audience? Was it other people, divine figures? And generally, what was literacy like?
Well, that's a very good question. So this is the hot seat now, yeah? So I'll try to be very, very quick in it. I think there's no one answer. I think the inscriptions tell us sometimes why people wrote. Some inscriptions are writing to kinsmen that the writer should be remembered, and hoping that that their kin would read their inscription and repeat their prayer. They asked passerbys to read this writing. You have a few texts, for example, very clearly in Safavidic that will say something like "Salam liman qara'aha kitaba." Right, very clear. So may the one who reads this writing be secure. So you have that. You have some inscriptions that are invocations to deities. They begin Ha and then a divine name, Ha Ruthaw. Oh, Ruthaw, this is an ancient god. Sa'idni min bi's hassanat. Help me against misfortune or evil this year. These types of invocations to the deities. You have other texts that are marking the buildings, building texts. For example, this structure was built by so and so, or marking territories. You have some texts that mark, they're funerary, so they're gravestones, and they're meant to let people know who's buried here, and that you could have people could, of course, make prayers for the deceased of some, or for the surviving members. You have a very beautiful prayer in Safavidic that you get in funerary inscriptions. They ask for the peace. They grieve for the peace. They grieve for the deceased. So wagama ala fulan, and then following that, wa ba'isa man dhalla. But those who remain alive despair. So it's the idea that the dead are at peace, but the living suffer, right? So you have these types of things. Salam liman sa'ira. may the ones who remain alive, that is the family, the kin of the deceased, may they remain secure. Many, many, many texts of this sort. So it's always about, I think, what you have to answer that question based on the text itself, and we're talking about Safavidic. But I think overall, I think the basic idea of why people write is, whether they realize it or not, is to be remembered. Anyone who inscribes their name, that name ultimately becomes a memorial. It will survive under normal circumstances. It will survive you. And so when I was in Mammoth Cave, Kentucky, a month ago or so, and I'm reading inscriptions of individuals who left their names there in the 1830s and the 1840s, and they'll probably be there for 1,000 years, if not more. I mean, it's incredible. And with the date, and no, I don't know who these people are at all, but they left their mark and they're being remembered somehow. You see? So I think there's that impulse as well to somehow survive one's demise, to have one's memory survive their physical existence. Of course, and for an individual, that can be as small as writing your name on a rock that people pass by, or if you have the resources, you might build yourself a pyramid. Same motivation.
Thank you for that, Professor. How do we know an inscription is actually going back to a particular date? Do we find inscriptions that were made several centuries later in an attempt to imitate already present inscriptions? And if so, how do we distinguish the dates between these two types of inscriptions?
Well, in ideal circumstances, you have inscriptions that can be dated in absolute terms. That means that the author decided to, kindly enough, leave us a date. They tell us what year they wrote the inscription. Now, when you do that, we get an idea of what letter shapes looked like in a certain period, and so you can develop something called you can have a paleographic chronology, where you can say that letter shapes evolve in a certain way over time. What that means is that, or certain spellings also develop over time in a certain rate. So that can give you, even if you don't have a date, you can have an understanding of when a text was produced. But sometimes we're just completely in the dark. So, for example, Safavidic inscriptions have dates, but we don't understand most of those dates. For example, you have a date like Sanat Mat Adram. Well, who's Adram? Why the year Adram died? Well, we don't know who Adram is, so we have no idea exactly when this inscription was written. But we get a general sense that the Safavidic inscriptions probably are before the 4th century CE. So when we see a Safavidic inscription, we are probably dealing with the time period before that, probably. Again, very vague. There's no reason to think that they go beyond that date because of the things that they mention. The events that they mention are actually, they don't mention Christianity or anything to do with the events of the 4th century and afterwards. So it seems like it's a reasonable hypothesis. In other cases, so we have absolute dates, we have paleography, letter shapes. Now, the thing is that people have memory. So people, when writing an inscription, people might choose, if we use the letter shape dating, to archaize. They want to write an inscription that looks old, right? And that's not necessarily uncommon. So the paleographic dating is not absolute. You might have inscriptions that look old that were written much later. And one of the best ways to kind of discover this, you can't always discover it, but one of the best ways to discover this is when you get idiosyncratic spellings or anachronistic spellings, right? So, for example, you have these letters that the Prophet Muhammad sent to various rulers, telling them to convert to Islam, and the letters themselves. The actual artifacts, I think their authenticity is they're not authentic, and the way you can know that is, although they try to use old-looking letters, they get a lot of the shapes wrong, or they get the logic of the writing wrong, but also the spellings, the way that the spellings are completely anachronistic. They're using spellings that were much too modern for the period. So there are a lot of these types of small things that people who want to give the effect of creating an ancient inscription aren't going to pay attention to, that experts can detect, you see. And as when it comes to forgeries, I mean, I think in the Arabian context, I have not seen any convincing forgeries yet. I get forgeries all the time. People send me forgeries, usually people will create forgeries to sell them. So I usually get Safavidic manuscripts or Safavidic writing on perishable materials, and it's all nonsense. Oftentimes, I can see which academic article, which script chart they chose to use to make the fake inscription. So far, it's been it's not. No, there hasn't been any convincing forgeries in that way. But for much of what we're doing, the chronology is in the air. We talk about pre-Islamic, but sometimes our margin of error is many centuries, and that will get better as more texts are discovered and as our understanding of the development of these different scripts improves. But at the current moment, we deal with a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the chronological dimension.
Thank you for that, Professor. So the final question is, what methodology is applied to determine the pronunciation of certain words in bilingual inscriptions? How important are these inscriptions, or how important have they been for the study of Arabic and other ancient Near Eastern languages?
Well, it ties into what you said earlier, which is not to assume that whatever meaning a word might have in a later Arabic dictionary holds true in the earlier periods, right? It's the same thing with pronunciation. The way we pronounce Arabic today is very different than the way Sibawayh actually described the pronunciation of Arabic. And even dealing with Sibawayh's pronunciation, so in the 8th century, we can't assume that held for the 2nd century. So bilingual inscriptions are our only way, really, or one of the primary ways, I should say, to understand how a language was pronounced in pre-modern, before there was any kind of oral tradition or description, before there was a formal description of the language. I mean, not the oral tradition, that can be variable as well. So, for example, Safavidic has a glyph. It's a hashtag, okay? And this hashtag glyph etymologically corresponds to the lad in Arabic, right? So the sad with a dot on it, the dotted D. Now, in modern times, when you go and take Arabic 101, Al-Kitab fi Ta'allum al-Lugha al-Arabiyyah, they teach you that this is an emphatic dal, dad, right? This is a very late pronunciation. This is not reflected in Sibawayh. Sibawayh, for example, says that this is a lateral, emphatic lateral fricative. So what does that mean? He says to put your tongue between your molars, for example, and release with emphasis. Lad. So it's an L type of sound. Okay, fine. Now, is that the sound that we would get in Safavidic? Can we assume that for Safavidic? Well, we would have no idea by just the hashtag. The hashtag has no phonetic information. We could assume so, but when Safavidic writers decide to write their names in Greek, a very common name is Radawat, right? Coming from the name Ruda, yeah? Radawat in classical Arabic, Radawa. This is a very common name in Safavidic. And when they do write it, they decide that the letter in the Greek alphabet that's closest to their lad is a S, a sigma. So they must have been pronouncing this lad in a completely different way than anything we have later. And we see it again. There's a big tribal group called life, right, related to life in classical Arabic, and they write it with a sigma. So using the Greek evidence and then understanding the history of this phoneme by looking at other Semitic languages, we can make a hypothesis that Safavidic probably pronounced this letter as the voiceless version of Sibawayh's lad, something like flod, right? So you can see why maybe that could be something pronounced as an S, or written with an S. Maybe S is the best approximate of it. But what is clear is that without these bilingual inscriptions, we would just simply have no idea how to pronounce most of these things. And because Safavidic writers, for example, were in contact and were writing Greek, they knew that there seems to have been a number of them who knew the Greek language, or at least the Greek alphabet, and they produced Greek texts. And we see that the kind of multilingualism found here is actually quite widespread throughout Arabia. We can vocalize Safavidic with some accuracy, with some confidence. We look at ancient South Arabian, Sabaic. Now, Sabaic is a much bigger corpus than Safavidic in terms of its attestation, linguistic richness. You have monumental inscriptions, very long sentences, all kinds of stuff. But the Sabaeans didn't use Greek ever, and so we have no bilingual Greek Sabaic texts. And for that reason, we absolutely have no idea how Sabaic was pronounced. We can make only educated guesses, but we don't have that Rosetta Stone type thing for pronunciation. Now, the same is true for any stage of the language. When we look at Arabic in the 7th century, now the 7th century Arabic as spoken in, for example, Egypt, that's not something that the Arab grammarians described. We can't assume that what the Arab grammarians described holds for there either, right? So that basic methodology needs to be applied to any period or form of the language that doesn't have a clear description associated with it. You see, whether from medieval times or in the ancient past.
Thank you so much for that, Professor, and thank you for this incredibly informative and rich discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I really learned a lot. Before we conclude the episode, I wanted to ask if you had any projects that you're currently working on or anything that you recently completed. And if you didn't mind just telling us about some of these projects that are in the pipeline.
Well, thank you. Yes, it was a real pleasure for me to talk with you about these subjects as well. So you can put a link to my academia.edu page on the episode, because I put most of my draft articles on Academia that can be downloaded and read for free or discussed, and so people can see what's coming out quickly. Also, I have one thing that's not under there is that I finished the I attempted a decipherment, at least. We'll see how well it holds up, but I think it's quite good. The reviewers recommended that it be published, so it will appear, I think, it will appear in BSOAS, a decipherment of the Thamudic, a variety of the Thamudic ancient Arabian alphabet that was previously not fully understood, only partially deciphered, called Thamudic D, and these texts are found from around Medina all the way up through Hail and Central Arabia up to Taima, really weird exotic corpus. And so I've completed its decipherment. Unfortunately, most of the inscriptions amount to bathroom graffiti, sexual boasting, and such things. But there was one text that was an incantation. And so that's of a tremendous use and interest, I think, to people. And so that's that will appear, I guess, sometime next year. And one other project that I'm doing, I think I'm going to share this and put it. Anyone on Twitter will realize that there are hundreds and hundreds of new inscriptions that get posted by amateurs in Arabia, going around taking photographs and posting them online, and they're hard to keep track of. And so I have a personal database of all that material, with who discovered it, when it was found, where it comes from, translation, commentary, any kind of relevant bibliography. And I use it for my own work, of course. These things are not published, but it's good for me to keep track of it. And I think I'm going to try to work to make this database public so that anyone can use it as well, because all this material is online, but it's impossible to find. And once you do find it, it's impossible to make any sense of it in any systematic way. So I think it'll be a good resource for both our colleagues and lay people alike. So look forward to that.
Understood. That's a crowdsourcing at its sense.
Yeah, absolutely. These guys are putting this material out, and I think I can kind of collate it and comment on it and make it useful to the scholarly and lay public.
And with that, I'd like to thank you again and conclude the episode. Thank you, Professor, for being on.
Thank you. My pleasure.